Yes.
Okay, let me just check. Can you see me? Can you still
Yes.
see me?
Yes.
All right. All right. So just give me a sign. Let me know when
Perfect. I'll flag it to you.
Okay.
We can just start, Richard.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual event, Securing Our Future, Parliamentary Leadership in Financing Climate Adaptation, part of London Climate Week here in London this week. Today, we gather to explore the pivotal role of parliamentarians in advancing climate adaptation finance and strengthening our nation's resilience against escalating climate risks. Climate change is not just academic. Climate change is not something of the future. It's real and it's here. And I think evidence of this is all around us. Just in the past few days and weeks alone, we've seen climate change at work in so many ways. We've seen monsoon rains and floods that have taken many lives in Bangladesh, in countries like Kenya and Tanzania in recent months, in East Africa. We've seen the effect of floods. We've seen the effect of droughts. In Saudi Arabia, just last week, we've seen a massive number of pilgrims who have lost their lives on account of heat. Again, extreme weather conditions. So climate change, it's real and it's here. My name is Richard Uku, and I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Global Center on Adaptation, based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and I'll be your moderator this morning. We have a distinguished lineup of speakers who will share their insights on critical issues around climate adaptation. But before we begin, I'd like to invite you to watch a brief video that highlights the essence of adapting to climate change. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And now, without further ado, let's proceed with opening remarks from our distinguished speakers of Parliament here this morning. First, we will hear from the Right Honourable Speaker Roger Mancien, the current Speaker of Parliament of the Seychelles and President of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, Parliamentary Forum. Seychelles is an island nation, particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we are honored to hear from you, Honourable Mr. Speaker. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Honourable Chair, honourable speakers of Parliament and parliamentarians, distinguished panelists and guests. Honourable Chair, first let me thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this seminar. I want first to reassure you and everyone concerned that the parliaments of SADC take this issue very seriously. Let me first just outline the situation for us. Our region, Southern Africa, as a whole is very susceptible to climate-related events, from Kenya and the Democratic Republic of Congo down to the Cape. The eastern part of the continent is prone to cyclones and extreme rainfall, leading to flooding in large parts. Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi, and the DRC are persistent occurrences. But this categorization is only part of the picture, because in many areas, droughts and flooding alternate. It is one moment, one catastrophe, and the next another. In island countries like my own, sea level rise is a threat that is becoming more and more serious, impacting on coastal infrastructure and economic activities. Experts tell us that the adverse conditions are set to continue and become more serious in the future. There is no doubt that they inflict great costs to life, living standards, and development. Among the most notable consequences are food insecurity, because rural farming areas are most directly affected with loss of crops from drought and flooding, water scarcity, an ever-pressing issue which may lead to insecurity and conflict. Health consequences, the proliferation of diseases with vulnerable groups, especially children most at risk. Damage to infrastructure, vital to economic sustainability. In short, there is a lot at stake. Parliamentarians have a lot to contend with. First, we have to be ever mindful of the danger that climate means for our region and for the world. We have to keep this issue in the forefront of our considerations. It is not always easy, because there are always other pressing short-term matters, things that demand attention now, and that require scarce financial resources. Parliamentarians representing a particular constituency may be tempted to think that climate adaptation is somebody else's business. We have to get it, that it is everybody's business. A second need is to be always mindful of the long term. It is not wise to lurch from one climate catastrophe to the next, and when we're done with one, just to put it behind us. We have always to remind ourselves that the next one is on the way. The only question is when. So, as parliamentarians, we have to be vigilant and persistent in giving attention to climate adaptation and building resilience. We have to require that national budgets have a component directly related to climate measures to repair damage and protect against future events. Second, we have to ensure that programs in other areas constantly take into account climate effects. Climate has to be part of the calculation across many areas of the national plan. We have to reconsider where and how we build houses, how flexible and resilient are healthcare facilities, how we can better secure communications, what kind of reserves we have in food production, and many other considerations. Parliament must also constantly monitor the allocation of resources to ensure that what we have is spent effectively and for maximum benefit. This, of course, is a crucial role of parliaments at all times, but climate contingencies make it much more imperative. Parliamentarians must be proactive, both in Parliament and outside, to build awareness of the challenges and to lead the way in finding solutions. They have to assess the implications of climate events for their constituencies and take every opportunity to bring them to attention, while they also look at the bigger picture and build partnerships in seeking lasting solutions. In this instance, what we are concerned with is securing finance and resources. With these words, Mr. Chair, I reiterate my support for the objectives of this seminar and my commitment to pursuing them in the institutions which I represent, the National Assembly of Seychelles and the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. Those were very stirring words regarding the responsibilities of parliamentarians all around the world, but especially in countries most vulnerable to climate change and the impact of climate change. We will now have the honor of hearing from the Right Honorable Jacob Francis Mudenda, the Speaker of Parliament of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, like many African countries, is highly susceptible to an array of climate risks. Honorable Speaker, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yeah. Thank you very much, moderator, and greetings to distinguished participants. Let me start by indicating that when we talk about climate adaptation, in other words, the impact of climate change on our environment, we need to contextualize the issue. In this case, Africa contributes only about 3 to 4% global greenhouse gas emissions, but suffers disproportionately from the impacts of climate change. And therefore, there has been need for urgent and comprehensive climate action so that we address the issue of climate adaptation. It is therefore imperative that African parliaments take note of the protocols that have been adopted by the African Union. These include the African Union Green Recovery Action Plan 2021 to 27, Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2022 to 2032, and the African Adaptation Accelerator Program are pivotal frameworks guiding adaptation efforts across the continent. It is therefore imperative that African parliaments respond to these guidelines in a practical manner by providing thought leadership within their parliaments in order to translate these protocols into domesticated law. According to the United Nations Environmental Programme UNEP Adaptation Gap Report of 2023, the adaptation finance needs for developing countries, including those in Africa, are estimated to be in the range of 160 to 340 billion annually by 2030. In this regard, Africa must marshal its vast natural resources to put in place a solid financial framework for adaptation. In this regard, it is important that we look at the potential for carbon credit tradings using our pristine environment, but at the same time making sure that we protect our African sovereignty in this matter. As far as SADC is concerned, I'm happy that our president of the SADC Parliamentary Forum has contextualized our approach to the issue. However, it is important that the SADC region must anchor the collaboration among member states and their parliaments in the context of the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan 2020 to 2030, which emphasizes, and I quote, enhancing resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change impacts across the region, unquote. In Zimbabwe, we have a draft national adaptation plan, which is being accepted by the citizens of Zimbabwe. According to this plan, Zimbabwe would need 10.3 billion United States dollars in order to close the adaptation gap and mainstream climate change between now and 2030. Accordingly, Zimbabwe has managed to mobilize 50 million United States dollars from the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund to buttress the local resource mobilization efforts. And in this regard, Zimbabwe is now seized with a new bill on climate change, which is meant to solidify the fragmented approach to climate change impact. And the current session of the 10th Parliament of Zimbabwe is likely to deal with this before the end of the year. Having said that, moderator, it is important that developing countries must push for the implementation of the promised 100 billion pledge by developing countries so that we can tap into this fund in our efforts in climate adaptation. And finally, it is important that we apply artificial intelligence in terms of prediction of climate change impacts, and in so doing, come about with smart agriculture, smart planning, and ensure that the application of artificial intelligence can reduce some of these impacts through a confirmed prediction of the climate change impacts. And in that way, we should be prepared to handle the question of climate change adaptation. In that regard, it is important that our members of parliament become strong advocates in this regard. I shall submit, moderator.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker, for those words of wisdom. Thank you to both speakers for those words. And I think you've elicited some points that we must especially take note of in terms of the tasks, the onerous tasks before parliamentarians. I'd like to especially recognize some of the protocols that you mentioned, protocols of the AU, and in fact, one of them, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, is one of those protocols that my organization, the Global Center on Adaptation, is central to, because this is a program. It's often called by those working on it or around it by its acronym, the AAAP, but I'll refer to it by its full name for the purpose of resonance, because a lot of people will be hearing about it for the first time, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And why it's impactful, along with the other protocols, the AU Green Recovery Action Plan and others, the Resilient Development Strategy, is because, and I must say, this is a program that was developed between the Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank as joint partners with the endorsement of Africa's leaders through the African Union. And it's been very successful so far. Let me just share a few facts about this program, because I think it's worthy of highlighting, and it's something that we at the Global Center on Adaptation, drawing on its success across Africa, thinking of replicating with other countries, other governments across the world, in areas where climate change presents a threat, particularly to the vulnerable nations that lie in that whole space of what we can call small island developing states. But the Africa Adaptation Program is Africa's answer to to the challenge posed by climate change. Africa's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is minimal, as the last speaker clearly pointed out. Yet geographical and economic factors, combined with the region's dependence on climate-sensitive sectors, make African countries highly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. And that vulnerability compromises the development of the continent significantly, and it threatens the lives and the livelihoods of millions of Africans. Like I said, the AFDB, the African Development Bank, and GCA came together to use their complementary expertise, their resources, and networks to develop and implement this program. But what it's done and what it is doing, continues to do, is galvanize climate resilient actions through a what we can call a triple win approach, addressing the impacts of from COVID-19, climate change, and the economy. And I won't go through them in detail, but it has four transformational, really transformational and interlinked pillars. One is food security, which has been mentioned already by the speaker. Infrastructure, nature-based solutions, youth entrepreneurship and adaptation jobs, because the youth are Africa's present and Africa's future. Africa is it's the youngest continent in terms of the youth bulge. And of course, adaptation finance, which both speakers have mentioned in their opening remarks this morning. So since its launch in 2021, this is a program that has helped shape, and I like numbers because they put things in context. This is a program that has shaped over $8.4 billion in investments that are building climate resilience for nearly 60 million vulnerable people in 35 countries and generating over 700,000 jobs. So it is a significant program, and that's why I thought I would take the time to actually do some highlighting and underlining of that program. Next, I would like to invite one of my own colleagues, and I don't know if he's here. He might be running late.
Richard, no, I'm here. Can you hear me well?
Very good. You are here.
I just landed in Beijing, and I'm very happy to be connecting to this conversation.
Fantastic, Ede. I'm glad you're here. Let me tell the audience who you are. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Ede Jorge Yaz Vasquez. He is the senior advisor to our CEO, and he will take the floor. Ede is a part of a two-person team responsible for but our flagship publication at the Global Center on Adaptation, and he'll talk about it. I don't want to rain on his parade, but he will provide a contextual overview of the climate adaptation finance landscape to frame our discussion. Ede, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so very much, and with your permission, I'm going to share a presentation, and
Please.
I want to make sure that you can see it well.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, excellent. So a great pleasure to be connected with all of you. Today, I will briefly talk about our latest analysis on the finance levels for adaptation, both globally and for Africa. And this is part of our annual flagship report, the State and Trends in Climate Adaptation series. We did first a global analysis. We did 2 years of Africa, looking at all of the dimensions of adaptation from microeconomics, finance, trade, youth employment to specific sectors, agriculture, water, infrastructure, etc., and cross-sectoral issues like health and education. And last year, we decided to focus specifically on finance. Actually, as an advancement, this year, we're going to be focusing on small island development states. Let me give you a few numbers out of the summary, so to give a little bit of context for the conversation. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that for the first time, global climate finance doubled and crossed the $1 trillion, a total of $1.3 trillion, annually in 21-22, which are the latest numbers that we have with much better certainty. And therefore, that is more than double what was before, a little over 600 billion tracking 2019 to 2020. So those are the good news. The not so good news, though, is that unfortunately, global adaptation finance is going backwards. From 7% of total finance in 2019-2020, it went down to 5% of 21-22. So the good news, more money is going to climate. The not so good news, proportionally, adaptation is losing ground. Now, in absolute terms, the adaptation flows were about $63 billion globally into this process. Now, what is the need actually for the global south in adaptation? The UNEP adaptation gap, the IPCC have calculated that developing countries currently need about $212 billion per year, but only 56 billion are coming to developing countries for adaptation. So what is the main message? Adaptation finance has to quadruple, 4 times larger than what is currently in. So between now, if we look at the following decade, between now and 2035, developing countries are going to need 3.3 trillion. If we stay at the current levels, only 840 billion will flow. It is urgent to increase adaptation finance. Now we did a little, where are the distribution among the regions? And actually it's interesting to see that East Asia and Pacific is the largest. The blue bars are local adaptation investments. The green bars are external. And yes, of course, that's an important part of their economy and trying to protect them against the climate shocks. But what is interesting is that Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region that is the most vulnerable in this process, is getting a much smaller portion of international flows for adaptation. Right now, Africa only gets 20% of the global adaptation finance flows. Only $13 billion came to Africa annually, okay? Now, what is fascinating to see, and actually a problem, is that despite the fact that Africa did not cause the climate change, that the emissions are really small, of all the climate finance that is coming to Africa, how much is going for adaptation? Only 36%, a little only over a third. Almost 2/3 go for mitigation. And yes, there are tremendous opportunities for mitigation in Africa, but the reality is that adaptation is critical for the development of the region. So we look on the right-hand side, the total adaptation finance, if we look at the current levels for the next decade, is only going to be 182 billion. The NAPs and the NDCs, the National Adaptation Plans, tell us that about 840 billion are needed. We did more detailed calculations, and we believe that actually those numbers are underestimated by a factor of 2. So we believe that what is needed over the next decade is $1.7 trillion for adaptation finance in Africa. So it's almost 10 times from 182 billion that with the current levels, the needs 10 times more than what is seen in that process. Now, this should not be seen only as a loss, as something that needs to be invested to prevent damages, but actually an investment in adaptation makes economic and financial sense. We calculated that if Africa is not able to mobilize that $1.7 trillion over the next decade, Africa will leave on the table, Africa will miss the benefits of adaptation as much as $6 trillion, and that makes no sense for Africa. Africa cannot leave on the table $6 trillion over the next. Now, is this the fault of African governments? Well, turns out that actually African governments are investing a lot in adaptation. Yes, most of the adaptation finance comes from the multilateral development finance institution, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and many other banks, about 63%. But African governments themselves are putting close to 19%, which is more than what the bilaterals are putting in adaptation finance for Africa, only 11%, okay? And African governments themselves put as much money as the grants that they're getting from the multilateral and the bilateral financiers. So African governments are moving on adaptation. The world needs to step up and follow that leadership. Private sector, for example, is a missing actor. It only puts 3% of adaptation, and actually it's mostly from foundations and not corporations. And our message is there's important business opportunities on adaptation. Another important finding is that the majority of the adaptation finance that is coming to Africa is channeled through loans. And you know the debt situation, how difficult it is today with the interest rates and with the challenges that Africa is coming. More than half, 54% of the adaptation finance in 2019-20 were channeled through debt. Now, in energy and transport, for example, the grant component of adaptation finance is less than 15%. Now, remember, Africa did not cause this problem, and Africa is actually having to borrow to deal with the consequences of this issue. Even for agriculture, where there's so many poor people in Africa working on, the grant component for adaptation is only about half, 53%. And the message I want you to take from this is that Africa is paying back the majority of adaptation finance. Now, another important message of the report was that there are more commitments needed for adaptation. We reviewed the 60 largest international and bilateral public financial institutions. And out of the 60, only 13 have made public adaptation specific commitments on numbers, on percentages of financing and the like. This has to change. Everybody needs to work harder on adaptation to be able to support Africa, of course, and many other regions of the world. And as Richard was describing, actually, we are moving from analysis to action. The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program over the last 3.5 years has influenced $8.4 billion of investments in 35 countries that as they get implemented, they're going to be improving the climate resilience of 57 million people and generating more than 700,000 jobs related to adaptation. And we're working with the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, the European Investment Banks to really being able to make sure that those flows really mainstream adaptation in very practical ways. Richard, I hope that this was useful as part of the overall introduction. There are important messages that came out of that process. African governments are working on adaptation, are putting the money. The rest of the world needs to follow suit. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Ede, for that elucidating presentation. Lots of facts and figures. I'm sure it will leave many people in our audience, wide-eyed. And I'm not going to go through those astounding figures again, but clearly, adaptation for Africa, climate adaptation finance must absolutely quadruple in the next few years. As you said, $3.3 trillion are needed between now and 2035, and we are not really advanced along that route as we should be. I'm still looking at these figures, and as you know, I mean, I look at these figures every day, but I think each time I step back and I look at them again, I see what a challenge we have. Let's take those figures though and go forward. They are alarming and they underscore the urgency of our discussion on climate adaptation. It's evident that all round much more needs to be done. Let's move to our panel discussion now and make this as interactive as possible. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive into our panel discussion. And I am pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. Before I go on, I'm sorry, let me just step back a minute. I did mention that Ede, who just spoke, is one of our colleagues responsible for our flagship report. That flagship report is called the State and Trends in Climate Adaptation Report, and it's produced annually. It provides a lot of very good, good is doesn't even qualify it, but very important information in terms of the analysis and the analytics that go into this. But what we are about is moving from taking these facts, taking these figures, and moving from analysis to action. And that's where everybody comes in. Now, our panelists. First, we have Honorable, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. That's clearly not my intention if I do. Honorable Nima Lugangira, or Luganjira from Tanzania. I might have been right the first time. Known for advocacy across sectors and recognized internationally for contributions to global governance networks. Welcome. We also have Honorable Marianne Bigum, member of the Danish Parliament and spokesperson on International Development Cooperation for the Green Left Party, one of the current opposition parties in Denmark. I'd like to also welcome Honorable Dr. Emmanuel Marfo from Ghana, Member of Parliament and Chair of the Environment, Science and Technology Committee, with extensive expertise in environmental policy and parliamentary leadership. Moving on, we have Honorable Jan Ries, R-I-I-S-E. Again, apologies if I mispronounce your name. Jan is a member of the Swedish Parliament and serves as the spokesperson on minority policy for the Swedish Green Party. Welcome. I'm also welcoming Honorable Senator Moses Kajwang from Kenya, renowned for his commitment to public finance management and climate action. Kenya is, of course, a country that's been in the headlines over the last few days, and we certainly wish the people of Kenya well in the midst of everything that's taking place there. We also have Honorable Nima Luganjira. Sorry, I did introduce you already. Now, Honorable Nima Luganjira, my question to you is, how can parliaments ensure that climate adaptation finance is effectively integrated into broader development policies and strategies to promote sustainability and resilience? How can parliaments ensure that climate adaptation finance, which we've talked about here this morning, how can they, or how can you as parliamentarians ensure that climate adaptation finance is effectively integrated into broader development policies and strategies to promote sustainability and resilience?
Thank you very much for that great introduction. Honorable speakers of parliament, honorable members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm Nema Luganjira, member of parliament from Tanzania. Just before answering your question, I wanted to quickly recognize the efforts of our President, Excellency President, Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, on this topic of climate adaptation. Firstly, she back last year, 2023, she was appointed to join the advisory board of the Global Center of Adaptation, which was, as a result of her great work in this area. But also, I would like for all of you to note that Tanzania is one of the first countries in Africa to draw up the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, the country compacts. So that again goes to show that kind of political will and leadership that we have from the level of our president. And finally, when we're talking about climate adaptation, there are also issues that are normally not spoken about, such as clean cooking. And our president, Her Excellency President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, is championing clean cooking in Africa through the Africa Women Clean Cooking Support Program that was launched last year at COP28. But this year, in May 2024, she co-chaired the Clean Cooking Africa Summit, where it was specifically to fundraise, and about $2.2 billion was raised to that effect. And I decided to start off this way because, when you have that sort of leadership from your president, it trickles down to also members of parliament. So the political will towards driving climate adaptation is critical. And now coming to our role as members of parliament and being mindful of time, we must recognize that at the moment we're grappling with the escalating impacts of climate change in our respective communities. For example, in Tanzania, I come from a region called Kagera. We border Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. And very recently, just last month, we had very heavy floods as a result of the overflow of water in Lake Victoria, and more than 700 households were impacted. So it's something that we're living day in, day out. So it's increasingly evident that there are insufficient resources for adaptation financing, and there's a widening gap between adaptation finance flows as well as the integrating this finance with other areas like accelerating sustainable development goals, as well as the national agenda. And when we look at the facts and the figures, it's very alarming. It means that we're falling short, and time is of essence. We don't have the luxury of time. Therefore, as a parliamentarian, I think I witness increasingly the intersection of climate change and the diverse outcomes, of vulnerable persons, even in my own community. And unfortunately, the most devastating realities are the impacts that it has on women and children, but the impact it has on also increasing the level of gender-based violence subjected to women and children, particularly is, when there's climate issues, you find that, it results to having maybe reduces the accessibility of water, which means women and young children, particularly girls, are going to be walking further away to look for water, and that subjects them to gender-based violence, and at the same time looking for firewood. So not only are they subjected to gender-based violence, but it also reduces the time for girls to study and reduces the time for women to be involved in economic activities. So it's like a vicious circle that through this climate adaptation, it has an impact on other key areas. So one of the things that's, it's very unfortunate is that governments and parliaments at the moment, we don't have the right capacity towards, resource mobilization and tracking this resource that is coming forward, with the MDBs and the DFIs, which is something that needs to be, I think collectively, we need to make efforts, as well as coming up with strategic interventions to capacitate parliamentarians to be able to do this role. We need to effectively monitor and evaluate mechanisms that are vital of ensuring this adaptation finance. Oftentimes in these big meetings, we hear commitments, we hear promises, but how are those promises being translated to reality? That is a role ourselves as parliamentarians we can play. But there's also another thing while I'm concluding, is that parliaments are well placed to track the progress of adaptation projects, as well as assessing their impact. Because it's one thing having the adaptation financing, it's another thing tracking that the project that money was used for and the impact that it has had in the community. So I think parliaments are well placed to have this oversight role, even with the climate adaptation, with adaptation financing, but also linking the global climate adaptation priorities with the national priorities, because we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, as we know that climate and the nature of climate is cross-cutting. So it's ensure that we also make investments into national development priorities that are resilient to climate change. For example, one of the earlier speakers spoke about the issue of food security, but I would also like to bring forward the issue of nutrition security. We mustn't forget that climate crisis has a direct impact on the nutrition security. And, unfortunately, SADC countries host the highest number of stunted children globally. So again, that goes to show the importance of interlinking all of these issues. And as I conclude, I think it's very important for ourselves as parliamentarians is that we need to recognize climate adaptation as a key component to national development, but we also need to ensure the integration of adaptation finance into broader development policies. And when we're developing laws, it is essential that we look at every sector. It can't be taken in silos. We need to take that multi-sector approach from agriculture to infrastructure, so that we can incorporate adaptation measures along that. And by enacting such policies, we'll be able to promote inclusive access of adaptation resources, and we can then be able to empower our communities to be resilient and improve their livelihoods. And just as to sum up, gender responsive budgeting is very critical. and targeting support for vulnerable populations is essential to this role. But, despite all of these challenges around the integration of adaptation financing, the future is bright. And as parliamentarians, we are all committed to play our role in this process. So I think it's a call to action to the likes of Global Center of Adaptation to engage us, capacitate us, and let us be the voice for the people to ensure that we can achieve the intended goals. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I mean, that was there's so much to unpack there. You actually did it wonderfully. I am a big admirer, a fan of your President Samia Suluhu Hassan. I listened to her very attentively in her intervention at the Clean Cooking Initiative. I'm a father of daughters, so I always highlight her. I always point towards her when I speak to my daughters about the power of women in Africa and women leadership in Africa. And I also, I look to you and take my hat off to you as well for the great job you are doing in the Tanzanian Parliament. With regard to your very last point, my CEO, Professor Patrick Vercoen, will likely be paying a visit to Tanzania in the coming months. So I hope we can sit down with you and continue this discussion bilaterally. But thank you very much for those very interesting points, especially about taking a multi-sector approach to climate adaptation. You talked about the very important point of gender-based violence, the fact that reduced accessibility to water, something that we see all over our continent in Africa, presents risks of gender-based violence against women, young girls especially. So you also talked about efforts to capacitate parliamentarians to mobilize resources more effectively. But thank you for those very, very thoughtful points. Before going on to my next question, I'd like to recognize the presence among us of the Speaker of Parliament of Eswatini, Honorable Jabulane Mabuza. Honorable Speaker, you are most welcome to this forum. My next question goes to Honorable Marianne Bigum, member of the Danish Parliament and spokesperson on international development. I think that's where I was. Let's see. No, actually, no. I misspoke before. My next question will be to Senator Moses Kajwang. Sir, what are the main challenges hindering adequate financing for climate adaptation initiatives, particularly in Africa?
Sorry, Richard.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, Honorable Kajwang is in a meeting now because of the incidents in Kenya. So he sends his apologies.
Okay, that's understandable. That's understandable. Okay. If he's able to rejoin us, we'll be happy to welcome him back. Let me move on to Honorable Jan, and I must ask you what the proper pronunciation of your name. Is it Reese? No? Honorable Jan Reese? Is she with us? Maybe not. All right. In that case, let me move on. Let's see. Dr. Emmanuel Mafo, Honorable Emmanuel Mafo. In the African context, how can Parliament support and incentivize the private sector to increase their financing of climate adaptation initiatives? Would you like to share your thoughts with us on that?
Before Honorable Mafo goes ahead, Richard, I just wanted to recognize that Honorable Jan Risa is on the line. I think he's just on mute.
Okay.
So give him a second to unmute.
All right. Okay, Dr. Mafo, that gives you time to contemplate the question I've just put to you. So we'll wait for Jan Rise to come on, and I want to know from her if her surname is pronounced in one syllable or two.
Honorable, you're still on mute. Perhaps you can just unmute yourself.
He, and it's he. Sorry, I said she. Forgive. And it might be Jan. No, if they're technical, if he's still having a technical issue, we can come back to him.
Absolutely.
And go to, so let's go to Dr. Mafo, and then we'll come back to Honorable Rise. Dr. Mafo?
Thank you.
You have the floor. Yes. I think your microphone was a bit muffled there.
Very much.
Now you're good.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure here. I'm good?
You're good. You're good.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So let me just stand on the existing protocols and to pay regards to all the speakers and the honorable speakers on the platform. First of all, the question of how parliamentarians or parliaments can support and incentive finance climate adaptation initiatives is multifaceted. We must first address why we need private sector resources in the first place. But let's put the whole discussion in context. If you look at the countries that are vulnerable to climate impacts, and particularly the Climate Vulnerable Forum, there are about 60 or so countries that form that platform. We have over 500 billion debt burdens. Each of these countries would have a very high debt to GDP ratios. At the same time, these countries have very ambitious climate action programs to pursue. Ghana, for example, has in our NDCs a number of ambitious programs that will burden us with some $2 billion annual yearly financing needs.
The NDCs, of course, being the National Development Plans.
The National Determined Contributions.
National Determined Contributions.
And yes. And these programs, so the point I'm making, the context I'm putting here is that we have ambitious climate goals that we want to make a contribution to, especially to adaptation. Yet we are burdened financially and by debts, and therefore we are unable to use public financing to as it were, fund all our climate actions. So certainly the question of private sector involvement would then become the obvious alternative. And that is why it is important that as Parliament, we are conscious of this reality and focus our advocacy and indeed our actions and oversight activities on the private sector. The private sector's involvement is very important, not only bringing financial resources, but also bringing innovation. It brings efficiency and expertise in project implementation. And so it is imperative that we as parliamentarians, within our legislative roles, support the establishment of clear regulatory frameworks that incentivize private sector investment in climate adaptation, such as through the provision of tax incentives, subsidies, and other financial benefits to companies that invest in adaptation strategies. We should equally continue to strengthen our public-private partnership regulatory frameworks to ensure that we capacitate actors to combine public financing or public funding with private sector expertise and capital to help leverage additional resources and ensure that adaptation projects are efficiently implemented. So access to finance remains a significant challenge, as I have said, even for many private sector entities, particularly those in the small and medium sized enterprises. And so as parliamentarians, we need to work towards financing options for these businesses. The world keeps innovating, finding new and improved tools that can support businesses, like, for example, through the issuing of green bonds, climate funds, and concessional loans. These are all financial tools that can be utilized to support climate adaptation projects. Parliaments are well placed to provide legislative frameworks that support these innovative financing tools. Additionally, a key element of our oversight role is rooted in ensuring transparency and accountability in the use of adaptation finance. So what is crucial, that it is crucial that we demonstrate our ability to monitor, track, and evaluate the effectiveness of the current investments into climate adaptation. And here I want to bring in an important project that is going to be implemented in 15 African countries through financial resources from the Green Climate Fund, through UNIDO and Climate Parliament, where the capacity of parliamentarians will be built in climate finance. So you cannot give what you don't have. So parliamentarians themselves must understand the climate financing space and understand, the tools and what incentives may exist for tapping into the growing global climate finance. So we need capacity for African parliamentarians. At the same time, we need capacity to interrogate national budgets to make sure that we are calling for green budgeting. So to what extent are our national budgets incorporating green financing arrangements and green projects into our national economy? So all these things, we need to have the kind of parliamentarian who has capacity to interrogate the executive budgets and programs in order to be able to look at where we can actually provide incentives that may attract private sector to also that is by and large what I meant. It's essential that lawmakers' capacity are built. And this includes access to up-to-date scientific data and best practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Mafo. That was really great. It's one often thinks that the buck stops on the table of the executive, but clearly, as you and your colleagues are demonstrating through these interventions, a lot lies on the desks of our parliamentarians, of our lawmakers. Some of the things you talked about, especially creating the legislative framework or legislative frameworks. You talked about the responsibility for transparency and accountability. That's one which resonates with me particularly, because I think that's an area through which we can make so much progress across the continent. So the responsibility of parliamentarians for monitoring, tracking, and evaluating these investments, and you gave a good example with regard to the project that will draw resources from the Green Climate Fund. Green budgeting you talked about, and ensuring that green projects are being factored in. So thank you very much for that. I worked for the private sector, the African private sector, for many years. So I know there is certainly the will. The will is certainly there for the private sector to complement the efforts of government, which are limited, which are constrained, of course, by debt, as you started out mentioning. So thank you for that. Let's go back to Honorable Rise, and I'm going to ask you to pronounce your name for us so I don't continue massacring it. I take it you've overcome the technical challenges. Are you with us?
I hope so. I hope so.
Okay. How do you pronounce your surname, sir?
It's actually Riise. It's a Norwegian name originally.
Riise.
But yes, like the German word for giant, I think. But
well, you're certainly a giant.
That's all there is to it at the moment. It's a small farm on the Norwegian west coast somewhere.
Okay. I have lots of Norwegian friends, so I'm going to impress them when I mention your name. Well, coming from an EU country, tell us, how can parliaments in EU member states ensure that international adaptation finance commitments are met?
Thank you. Very, very good question. And first of all, thanks for inviting me to this session and company of such distinguished members of other parliaments around the world, or basically mostly in Africa, of course. And also let me express my concerns about what's unfolding in Nairobi. It's a city of with a special relationship to me, not least because my daughter was there for one of her high school years recently. And I used to work with the UN Habitat a bit before.
Yeah.
So, but I greet you now from Gotland. It's an island in the Baltic Sea where there is an annual political week where almost, a large proportion of Swedish parliamentarians take place and discussing hundreds of different topics. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that foreign policies and foreign aid and support for international development is kind of lacking, which is part of my response to your question. This used to be a big Swedish thing, the international development, but as you may know, in Sweden, as in some other European countries, we see this right-wing turn. Actually, in the whole of Europe, if you notice the European Parliament elections just a couple of weeks ago, which makes me a bit worried about the future of this. But I guess it's likely, we'll turn back at some point. So what has happened is that the discussion about the fairness of supporting international development, including, of course, climate adaptation measures, has slowed down a bit. And I think we have a serious discussion ahead of us concerning what should we call it? The acceptance of a kind of debt towards developing countries, as you may know, not the debt itself, but how big it actually is. And that is an important issue that we have to discuss. So in relation to your question, I would say that the problem is not the actual commitment to the funding when it's done. The actual challenge is to get there. We have, as parliamentarians, we in Sweden and probably also in many other countries, I'm a member of the Committee of the Constitution of the Parliament, which means I'm one of those who scrutinize the government each year. What do they do? What they don't do? What have they said they would do? And if they said they would do something, did they actually do it? And to our help, we have authorities like the National Audit Office that scrutinizes all the figures and numbers and decisions that are made. And the problem, or again, the challenge is the process itself. Work in progress is one of those issues that there may be decisions that are not actually carried out within the time frame that it was supposed to be. But if there is a decision, then it's rather safe because we have all those control mechanisms built into it as parliamentarians. The foreign policies, international development is the government responsible for, at least in Sweden, and the parliament is scrutinizing their work. So I would say that the actual realization of the commitment is not really a challenge. If we get that far, it's not a problem anymore. Our challenge is the discussion on how to get to an acceptance of the debt and the acceptance of the size of it and the acceptance of this has to be done rather urgently. And maybe I could stop there for a moment and see if there are things to follow up on that later in the discussion. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. Indeed, it's an important challenge to overcome, how to get to the to an acceptance of the debt, how much it is, and how to take care of it, how to address it. Thank you so much. Let's go to a let's see, Honorable Marianne Bigum. My question to you is, what role do you think the private sector can play in the efforts to ensure adaptation, climate adaptation, in countries in the global south?
Thank you so much for the question and for the invitation, not the least. I wanted to say that actually this topic has been high on the political agenda for me, as well as in the parliament, in the Danish parliament, for more than a year. It looks like the picture froze, but I hope
I think we can hear you clearly, but your picture is frozen.
Great. I don't know. As long as you can hear me then. We've actually had a long process, both in my party, on developing a new strategy for collaboration and partnership with Africa, which has really been under high. I know that the topic is broader than Africa, but I'm going to speak into that topic here. We've had a long, in-depth in our party policy development on this issue. We've had similarly in the parliament, we have had this as a high on the agenda for the development aid and for the global climate committee. The government is almost finished, I believe, with a strategy on this same issue that obviously is much broader, but also deals with the aspects of climate adaptation and funding and role of private sector and all these things that we're talking about today. I'm saying this because as an input to this, I have 4 pages of a lot of cool things I would love to share. And obviously, we can't do all of that today, but I'm actually just following the debate. I'm thinking about actually having it translated into English, if it's something that could be useful, because I really do want to share all the good proposals that we have. So I want to talk to first off one thing I think is hasn't been mentioned, but is high and is important on the private sector, and what we can do as parliaments in that. And well, basically, I do believe that we talk a lot about the role of the private sector, as in development, investing, and all these things. What I want to add to the conversation is that we need also to have effective taxation systems. We need to be implementing the OECD agreement with minimum corporate tax to make sure that the companies are not avoiding taxes, and that the right amount of taxes are being paid in the countries where that they're being earned, and none the least in the global south. So that's actually pretty high on my agenda, and I know it seems a bit out of scope, but from what I hear, I mean, I really do think that this is one of the key aspects in order to get the money into the system, so that it doesn't have to be loans and debts and all these things, and just to make the system working. Because what we're doing right now, what the private sector, part of the private sector, not all of the private sector is doing right now, is actually a huge barrier in order to make sure that the countries have the necessary funds to adapt to climate changes. I do also think that what we should be focusing on, in the role of the private sector, is that the investments that we do are supporting countries in industry activities, so that it benefits the publics and the local development and ownership. I mean, it's the old school way of doing it, where we invest in Western companies that come to countries and make money of something and then leave. We want to be much more inclusive in that. I think that is really we've known that forever, but we haven't been able to do it. But it's something that I believe will be high. I really hope will be high in the strategic strategy that we are about to deliver here in Denmark. At least it's high on our priorities. So we're working with various things in Denmark. We have investment funds that we want to be able to support climate projects in a better way. Definitely climate adaptation projects in a better way. I must be honest to say it's been a little bit difficult also for us as parliamentarians to follow that, but it's something that we are trying to follow to make sure that the funding is being spent in a proper manner and that it's being used effectively. It was mentioned, I believe, by Emmanuel Morfu, the need for capacity for national parliamentarians. And just adding to that, we have staff in the Danish Parliament that can help us. And I'm going to give you an example of that. We've been following a lot on our development aid, for instance, where we weren't delivering on our national targets of 0.7%. And it was difficult for us in the opposition to actually get the government to commit on what was going on and make sure that the money was being actually that the political agreements that we have were also being followed. And as a parliamentarian, I mean, this is huge and it's pretty difficult, which is also I'm hearing other people say in this meeting, it's pretty difficult to follow. But we have economic advisors in the parliament that are non-political, that are simply a parliamentarian staff that can help us in raising these issues. So I wanted to add to that. We have I want to make sure on the investments funds, I mean, we want to be following them as much as possible to make sure that the money is being spent. We obviously, well, not obviously, but at least for our party, the loss and damage fund is very important to us. We want to make sure, and we are pushing to make sure that we are honoring the commitments, that we are listening to the countries in need of support. What is the actual need? We want to make sure that it's a just transition, that as it was said, that it's not the countries in the global south that's responsible for the climate pollution that we are seeing. We want to add more funds, concrete initiative for innovative funding, and we want to be working with Denmark as a member of the EU. And we are also in that respect wanting to push, and I think that Denmark in general are doing better than others, but we want to take that into EU and also make sure that EU is pushing for the same thing. So that's where we politically are trying to push forward right now. We want it's from the Green Left and a few other parties as well in the opposition. We have actually formed an alliance on some of these things. Also that the loss and damage fund has to be new money and not taking from existing development aid. That is unfortunately what we've been doing up until now, and that's not very good, but we're continuously to push for parliamentarians for that. Other important aspects and roles of the private sector. I really do think, and I come from a background in the private sector as well, I really do think that we need to be much more in partnership in these projects. We want to make sure that we're delivering knowledge and capacity and using all projects, not just to, for instance, build an industry or build an incinerator, but to actually provide the skills for the local or for the countries that we're working in to be able to build them themselves. I don't want to build incinerators, but it's just an example because I'm a West engineer and I know that's one of the things we're doing. But my point still goes that we need to be focusing a lot on skill capacity. I do think also I really agree with the focus that was mentioned earlier on an additional focus on on especially small and medium-sized enterprises, access to finance on that. I do also think that what I've been seeing in my work life is that the amount of financing that goes to big industry, and it goes to big industry and middle-income countries, and not necessarily the countries that actually need. We need to be reducing poverty as well, because it's easier. And I think that we should be working more on being better at building up projects. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but you could take care in the project development phase on making sure that the grounds for scaling up projects and making big projects, rather than just going into existing big plants or big projects. And I think the private sector here could do something in relation to that as well. Let me just check my 4-page document to see if there's something obvious that I've missed. Oh yeah. And it goes beyond actually on your question, sorry. But I do completely agree with that we shouldn't, that we should be, all the loans that we've given is just adding debt. We should stop that, and we should annul the loans. I think that's, let's move forward. We could do that.
Well, that is an excellent point to end your intervention on. Let's stop the debt. Let's stop the loans. Well, stop the debt, because that is such an inhibiting factor to progress by so many countries. So thank you for that. You talked about, I mean, many things that I'm not going to go back over your 4-page document, but it was extremely rich. From the effective taxation systems, ensuring that there's no tax avoidance by companies investing in the global South. You talked about investments supporting industry activities, and that's a very big one for me in particular. It's one I've followed for a long time, ensuring that there is inclusivity and that these investments support local industry, support manufacturing, not just companies investing and leaving without any value added. So that all that is very important, and I particularly thank you for mentioning the honoring of loss and damage, honoring that commitment, just transition, and partnerships for helping to deliver skills to strengthen capacity across the region, and of course access to finance by SMEs, and a whole lot more. So thank you very much for that. Before we go to an open discussion, I'd like to invite the Speaker of Parliament of Eswatini, Honorable Jabulane Mabuza, to the floor to make any comments that you would like to, and then we'll go to open discussion. Honorable Speaker, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, moderator, my colleagues, honorable speakers present, SADC PF Secretary General, and all dignitaries present. My name is Jabulane Mabuza from the Kingdom of Eswatini, very small country, but beautiful. Very nice country, peaceful, and you are invited one way or the other to join us, especially when we have different events that we celebrate in the country. In terms of culture, we are one of the best. Greetings to all of you. In an effort to facilitate adaptation action, the country has done the following: creating an enabling environment. A climate change policy was developed in 2016, and the policy presents the vision for a climate change resilient and a low carbon Eswatini. with a goal to build a climate resilient nation and its economy and facilitate low carbon development in a manner that promotes national priorities of inclusive growth and sustainable development. And the objectives that cover adaptation and finance are as follows. Provide an enabling policy framework for effective implementation of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation measures. Secondly, to enhance climate resilience and inclusive low carbon green growth investment, promote public education, information, awareness on climate change, and establish and maintain an effective institutional framework to mainstream climate change response into relevant sectors and into planning, budgeting, decision-making, and implementation, both at national and community levels. Incentivize private sector involvement in building climate change, resilience, and engaging in low carbon development opportunities. And on adaptation, the policy gives policy statements for 7 adaptation sectors, namely water resources, agriculture and food security, energy security, climate risk management, disaster risk management and resilience, forestry, healthy biodiversity convention and ecosystems, and it further gives policy statement on climate finance, that is, ensure sustainable financing for climate change efforts from national budgets, regional and international sources. Strengthen institutional arrangements that will enhance interagency coordination and integrate climate change into national development planning and budgets, and establish a national climate finance institution and strengthen existing financial arrangements to harness and manage climate finance. That promote access and use of market mechanisms in mobilizing climate finance and enhance partnership with development partners, the climate sector, to facilitate increased flow of climate finance into the country. Build capacity of government ministries and departments, parastatals, CSOs, and private sector to ensure the absorptive capacity of available financial resources in implementing adaptation and mitigation actions. On international finance, as a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement, the country has access to funds established under the convention, and this includes the Global Environment Facility, which has a window for climate change. The country continues to benefit from these funds with current activity, including but not limited to the Small Grants Program, which benefits communities and civil society organizations. And the country current allocation has been allocated for biodiversity adaptation targeted towards the Big 5 project, and currently a project preparatory phase. The country is also benefiting through a regional program targeted at adapting transboundary waters. The country has made her first submission to the Adaptation Fund for a project seeking to build adaptation in the agriculture and food security area. The country also continues to benefit from the Green Climate Fund. Resources received from this fund has been mostly readiness funds to strengthen their institutional capacities, governance mechanisms, and planning and programming frameworks towards a transformational long-term climate action agenda through technical assistance and grants. However, the country is now moving into a phase of submitting proposals for actual climate action. Some of the projects under preparation targeting the GCF include improving climate resilience in the Kingdom of Eswatini through integrated management of mountain ecosystems, resilient rural communities in Eswatini through improved climate adaptation, enabling environment and access to long-term finance, increasing the resilience of Eswatini's agro-pastoral communities through integrated ecosystems and watershed management, and strengthening urban resilience in Eswatini through climate proofing of green, gray, and blue infrastructure. And furthermore, in order to improve access to the fund, the country is working on accrediting local institutions to the fund, namely the Eswatini Development and Savings Bank and Eswatini Environment Authority Environment Fund. This exercise is being supported through the readiness programming. Other bilateral, including group of countries, financing has been accessed, such as Taiwan supported the strengthening of early warning systems through the provision of hydrological and meteorological observing equipment and capacity building of the meteorology department, piloting of permeable surfacing from the India, Brazil, and South Africa, IBSA. And this does not go without challenges, Program Director, which include the complications of providing a climate rationale for adaptation projects, which is often complicated, resulting in a high transactional cost for accessing adaptation financing, especially from the multilateral funds. B, the need to strengthen monitoring for climate finance, especially private sector financing and donor funding coming through NGOs. The need to strengthen monitoring of climate finance opportunities. Though efforts have been made to build capacity for assessing climate finance, capacity is still very low and a lot more needs to be done. The climate change bill is still under development, and learning from others on how best to close policy gaps would assist the country leapfrog towards more effective adaptation finance mobilization and adaptation action. Thank you, Program Director, and thank you, speakers, moderator, for the very important meeting that we are having today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker, for sharing with us what Eswatini is doing in this space and how it is availing itself of the resources for strengthening climate adaptation action in the country. That was very comprehensive. I am responsible for time and timekeeping as moderator. So I'm going to go take us to open discussion, and I'm going to start with a question, and I'm going to ask that the questions be brief and the answers be equally brief. The first question is from Amira Saber, who says, and this is a question that's she addresses to, I think, any of the panelists or all the panelists. I wish the esteemed hosts and panelists would address the complexity of climate funding projects in Africa and the lack of strategic planning for the priorities of climate financing. And this is MP Amira Saber from Egypt asking this question. I throw it out to any of the panelists. Honorable Nima, I see you smiling and leaning forward, so I take that as a sign that you'd like to speak to this.
Thank you. Being mindful of time, I think that's a very good question. And what I can say is, there are a number of challenges that revolve around, first of all, lack of capacity, lack of technology, and lack of finance for African countries. And as such, we need to develop comprehensive long-term strategies that, that identify key areas of need, but also streamline the funding applications and ensure efficient use of resources. Even when there's call for funding for NGOs, for example, the requirements that local NGOs have to meet are so stringent such that they're not even able to qualify. So you find that it's international NGOs who will win the funding, and then there's no sustainability for local NGOs because there's no capacity building. So I think we need to review the entire restructure the financing mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Nima. Nice, crisp answer to that question, and I hope that's satisfactory for our MP from Egypt. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? I'm going to ask.
A hand from Dr. Marfo.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And greetings to Sabah. I would say two things. First of all, there is a need to
Dr. Marfo,
action and programs into the national policy strategy. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. It was a bit spotty. The reception was a bit staccato there, but I think we can hear you better now.
Okay, very well. So I'm saying that there are two things that are my response will be two. One, there is the need to mainstream climate action, climate programs into national strategic programs. So, for example, if you come to Ghana, we usually have what we call the medium-term development plans, which is supposed to provide the overarching national development strategy for the country. You cannot be having such a plan and then be developing other things alongside without mainstreaming. So we make sure that our NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions, call it our climate action program, is integrated into that medium-term development plan, so that Parliament providing oversight would then know that once there has been an integration, once you are providing oversight for the development programs, you know that the climate issues have been taken care of. And it also informs you about budgeting. You are also able to track budget allocations properly if these programs are well integrated. And I think the problem we have in Africa is that we continue to develop parallel strategies, action plans, and what the adaptation plans in silos. We come to a point where we bring them together, integrate them very well, and mainstream them. If we can do that, then I'm sure that problem will be resolved. Thank you very much.
Right. Without a multiplicity of parallel plans at the same time. Yeah, no, quite. Well, thank you. Thank you for that contribution. Would any of the other panelists like to speak to MP Saber's question? Or do we have that taken care of? I'm looking for hands. I don't see any. I'm asking my colleagues, Salam, if oh yes. Oh, let's see. Is that an old hand, Dr. Marfo?
Yeah, it appears to be an old hand.
Yeah, it's an old hand. Yeah,
an old hand. Okay. I'm looking for other hands in the room, or anyone from the audience. Let's see. I see 4.
Yes. We have a hand from an MP from Namibia, Honorable Philippus Katamelo.
Okay. Let's see. Why don't you? Okay. What's the question? I'm looking through here. See.
There's no question, but he has his hand up. Perhaps.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Can we give him the floor, please?
Sure. He's on.
Please.
Hello, am I audible?
Hi, welcome.
Okay, first and foremost, thank you for the presentations and the good work. I've got just some a question maybe for us. What the question has been coming, but I didn't get the answer. What is it in terms of the projection? It seems we, as Africans, we are not going to reach the envisaged target of climate financing. Yeah, the adaptation finance targets in terms of the projections that has been made has not been made. Now, what will be our role? What needs to be done differently now as Africans in order to reach that milestone?
That's a very direct question, and one which really strikes to the heart of the challenge. As Africans, and it's not necessarily a pessimistic outlook. I think it's a realistic one. And the question is, as Africans, how do we reach the target? Projections have been made, but from all indications, it looks like we're not getting there. I mean, my CEO, Professor Vercoen, at the Global Center on Adaptation, often stresses this point. You know, we're not winning the battle unless things change. So as Africans, what do we need to do? What needs to be done differently? So let's put that question out there. And that might be, I think, a concluding question for us. Dr. Mafo, you have your hand up.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. And I think that comes down to how we do politics and we govern ourselves as a continent. So first of all, we need to understand that we need to reduce public expenditure quite significantly. You cannot be calling for people to give you money or private sector to come in when we continue to have a typical public sector that is, so to speak, wasteful in public expenditure. So first of all, we need to free fiscal space by cutting down public expenditure. The second thing is that we need to, as I mentioned, continue to build this public-private partnership in areas, for example, in infrastructure and areas that the private sector can effectively participate, and free fiscal space for government to focus on things that are of general public good nature. So, for example, climate action, adaptation plan implementation. So we are able to free some budget for that. Then the third thing, of course, will be on the global development partners or the global economic structure itself to also reform and make sure that we are putting more money to finance climate adaptation in the name of climate justice, so that those who are polluting will need to know or will need to come to understand that they have a responsibility towards those who are being impacted disproportionately. And therefore, we need to increase global green financing for development. And in this regard, I would continue to recommend the debt to climate swap as a mechanism that can work, because when we have been able to identify very good bankable adaptation projects in Africa, we should be able to talk to the debt, those who Africa is indebted to, be able to swap some of these debts,
right,
for specific climate adaptation projects in Africa.
Okay. Thank you for that. And wow, the hands are going up now. So there's a lot of, let's see, the first hand I saw was Marianne Bigum and the honorable member from Namibia. So let's go to Marianne first.
Thank you so much. Well, I was listening to the questions and also reading some of the ones in the chat box. As a parliamentarian, I can't answer a lot of these questions because they're very detailed on how how the finances work. So I wanted to just give a bit of background of how we work. In Denmark, it is the minister who basically has the money, who can prioritize the projects. It is his ministry that follows the projects, and will, have the oversight of it. It's simply impossible for us to get that kind of insight. We have a yearly report being made up where we get a presentation of how the money was spent and all these things, and then we can come forward with our prioritizes. However, what I do want to say is that if you there was a question, how can we as parliamentarians, and how can Africa, and it goes really a lot of the other way. So I'm also struggling a bit with how can I help. I'm very much reliant on organizations and ambassadors or whoever coming to me and saying, so we're experiencing this concrete problem. We're experiencing that the money is being misspent on something not what we want. It should be spent in a different manner. How can you help? With that information, I can address the minister in my country and say, I've heard this issue. How will you resolve it? So that's like very concrete. So just bridging some of these hindrances and gaps and all these things. I also need knowledge the other way around, because I'm not following the projects in details. But if you, for instance, see issues with how the youth can be, what was the question? How can we enable local level adaptation? If you come with a suggestion on how to enable that, I can use that. And how we can, I think it was a question on how we can involve the youth. Well, come with a proposal and I can lift that and try and make that happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Time is really going now. I'm going to ask our honorable honorable member from Namibia to be very, very brief before we go to like one or two last questions. No, maybe it's an old hand.
Yeah, no, it was, I have asked my question.
Okay,
it's
fine. Okay, all right. Let me go to, we have a question here in French that's coming from Nana Haruna Mahamadou. And the question, I'll read it in French and then I'll translate it. Quelle amélioration des cadres juridiques nationaux proposeriez-vous pour les États, s'il vous plaît? What improvements of legal, les cadres juridiques, legal professionals, national legal professionals, do you propose for states? So how can we strengthen capacity among legal experts, national legal experts? Anyone?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Okay. In French or English?
English.
In English. What improvements or how can national legal specialists be assisted or strengthened in strengthening of capacity? What proposals would you have for that in countries?
If I may go, I think what we need to do, because it's very clear that there's a limited capacity, there's a limited understanding on climate adaptation, the issue of adaptation financing and how it integrates with a multi-sectoral approach. So I think perhaps one of the key interventions can be to have dedicated funding for capacity building, for equipping not only the civil servants who are responsible in this role, but also the legal practitioners, as well as, again, the parliamentarians, because we all work hand in hand. It can't be in silo. If we in Parliament create the laws, it means our legal colleagues are going to be responsible when there's a breach of those laws. Civil servants are also responsible for drafting the plans, the budgeting. Then as Parliament, we have oversight. So I think we need to have a pool of funding dedicated for capacity building. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have simultaneous interpreting. So, Nana, j'espère que la réponse vous satisfait. We are out of time. And now I am being gently tapped on the wrist by the organizers to say I should bring this to a conclusion. There are other questions here. I wish I could read them all. Nemeka, Noha, Solomon, listen, we'd love to get to your questions, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I hope there is some form or fashion whereby the questions that we can't get to are picked up, and we can pass them to the panelists offline so that you can get the answers that you require to these questions. But this has been, I always like the interactive part of these forums, which is where we can really get a lot of exchanges of views. Lest I run into any more problems on the time side, I'm going to conclude the discussion here. And I'd like to thank our panelists for their valuable I should say invaluable contributions. To wrap up, we have Jonas, and I will surely mispronounce your name if I try. So I'm going to let you, as you wrap up, say your surname, Jonas, Secretary General of Dan Church Aid, who will provide closing remarks. Jonas, please.
Thank you very much, Richard. And let me say my last name is called Nødekær, and it is difficult to pronounce indeed. So Jonas is perfect, and I think it goes in most places. So very happy to be here to address this concluding remarks. And it's been truly extremely interesting to listen in on the conversation also. And as you said, Richard, I think the active sort of question and answering session is a testament to the relevance of this discussions we've had here. So just allow me just to start by thanking everybody on behalf of the Global Center on Adaptation, the SADC Parliamentary Forum, and Dan Church Aid for really setting time aside today for this conversation. Special thanks, of course, to the keynote speakers, to the panelists, to yourself, Richard, but also to everybody else who has been listening in the audience. It's been a true pleasure. I think listening in, I think we can all agree that the need for a strengthened focus on adaptation is really there, and it needs to be articulated and again. And it goes both for the finance need, but also pointing out sort of those particularly vulnerable, as indeed some of the speakers were pointing to, those that are mostly affected by the climate changes as they come in. I've been encouraged, representing a civil society organization that's working with 200 different national civil society organizations globally and across Africa, also to listen to the commitments by the members of the speakers and members of parliament, and recognizing the role and commitment that they can play in terms of keeping governments accountable to not only doing the speeches, but actually taking action and delivering on the plans that they set up. And I just want to emphasize that working with civil society can also play a crucial role in this. And one of the things that Dan Church Aid can do is exactly work with some of the national civil society organizations in your respective countries, so they can help and support parliamentarians also in the monitoring of the adaptation plans also. So as we walk away from today's session, I mean, I hope that we can all commit to keeping the discussion alive, making sure that we continue, because truly this is not just done with today's conversation, but it requires an active and ongoing commitment and attention. So really, thank you on behalf to everybody, and on behalf of the organizers, I wish you all a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas, and thank you all for participating in this critical conversation. Together, we can drive the momentum needed to secure our future through effective climate adaptation and finance. And we will. A poll has appeared on your screen, or should have appeared on your screen. Please take a moment to complete it so we get your feedback on this webinar. Again, thank you everyone for completing the poll, and thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah.